Colin, and we're excited to talk about interoperability today. So it's actually kind of funny the way we were just catching up on this, and I was saying I was originally at Centrifuge before Chainlink, and so it's fun to be here. And I was like, look, when I was at Centrifuge, I didn't really think much about interoperability. It wasn't like at top of mind when I was there. As soon as I got to Chainlink, all we talk about is interoperability. And so I walk in and I'm like, so it's like interoperability, like now is it like the hot topic, is like a new thing? And everyone's like, no, we've been talking about this from day one. So let's start here. Let's talk about kind of the genesis of, from all your different seats and the way you look at this. How long have we been talking about interoperability? How big of a problem is this? How long have we been trying to solve this? Let's just kind of go back to, where did this all begin?
Sure, yeah, so I'm Ethan, I'm one of the co-founders of Cosmos. So interoperability has been like in our blood from the very beginning. So back in 2016, we had this vision that, look, a lot of people are out there trying to build these mainframe computers, mainframe versions of blockchains, big bad public blockchains, as if all of the world's compute could occur on one chain. And we said, no, that's not gonna work. IBM tried that in the 70s or whatever, and that's not what happened. We ended up with personal computers and an internet, right? And so the way that worked is in the personal computer regime, every individual had sovereignty over their own device, and we developed interoperability protocols to enable every machine to talk to every other machine, right? And so we saw the same thing coming for blockchains, and we said, look, there's gonna be hundreds, thousands, millions of blockchains in the future. We'll call them community computers, and what's important is that each community can be sovereign over their own network, right? But that those networks are interoperable with each other. So right from the beginning, we were designing an interoperability protocol that would enable arbitrary community computers, arbitrary blockchains to interoperate with one another, send messages with one another, trust what one another are doing or saying in a standard way that allowed them to be sovereign independently so that they could exist in their own world with their own infrastructure, their own applications, but still be able to communicate with others, right? So that sovereignty didn't come at the cost of some kind of communication or interoperability. So we built IBC, the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, today one of the most valuable and popular interop protocols out there, processing billions of dollars in token transfers and other kinds of interoperability communications on a daily basis with no rent seeking. There's no sort of middleman. There's no one extracting fees from that. We can get into the sort of finance and funding of open standards as we go, but interop has been there from day one for us, and it's been something we've been trying to get the Ethereum community to pay attention to because we knew it was coming for them, right? We knew that down the sharding wasn't going to work out the way they were kind of expecting, and that they would leverage kind of Cosmos style principles and philosophy to ultimately scale Ethereum, which is what's starting to happen now. And a lot of the things they're struggling with in terms of building bridges and how do you secure the bridges and how do you have token standards across different rollups and how do you understand the state of things across the different rollups. These are all kind of problems Cosmos has been dealing with for years now in production. So yeah.
Should I go? Okay. Yeah, hi, my name is Emilio. I work in Navarra. Yeah, for us, interoperability, like maybe coming from a different perspective, but it's been like a big problem also from the early days as well. When I think about interoperability, there are different degrees of interoperability in my mind. Like one is inter-protocol interoperability. So in DeFi terms is ability of plugging the features of one protocol into another. So for example, at Aave, what we build is usually Aave aims to be like the base liquidity layer where liquidity provisioning happens, and it allows usually people to access this liquidity in a permissionless way. But not only people and users, but also other protocols eventually can access this liquidity in a permissionless way, which means that you need to build in a way where it's possible for these protocols to plug in seamlessly and interoperate with Aave in a transparent way. So that's one problem. We also face the same problems that were mentioned before when the Aave protocols start to move in a multi-chain environment, right? Because like Aave currently is deployed, I think, on 13 networks or something like that. And we had to build, it was necessary to build an infrastructure that would allow to govern these protocols in a permissionless way. and that was, it is still an open problem that required building a lot of infrastructure around. So we were talking before in the backstage about ADI, that is the infrastructure that was built by BGD Labs to allow intermessaging, permissionless intermessaging between the different markets that we have within the Aave ecosystem. So yeah, it's been quite a ride in terms of work. There is still a lot of work to do. We have seen lately a lot of developments around super chains, hyper chains, elastic communication, and so on and so forth. And it's been it's going to be very interesting to see where this is going to go in the next years, and maybe we'll start seeing more IBC adoption as well.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeroen, the CTO from Centrifuge. I think I want to take a little bit further on Emilio's point, which is that for me, interoperability is much more than just communication between different chains and how do we align that. And it's rather like how do you integrate and get different systems to work together. And I think the reason this is such a big problem and a big focus is that this actually comes back to the main value proposition of why you would use a blockchain or even why you would tokenize a real asset, right? So one of the main reasons for doing this is actually being able to use the composability of DeFi, being able to bring utility to these assets if you go back to real world assets. But how do you get to composability? That's by integrating different systems, integrating different protocols, building apps on top of other apps, and so on. Which is not possible if you don't have interoperable systems working together, building on each other, right? So it's not just about standardizing on the layer of how do you communicate between chains, but it's on how do you tokenize an asset and how do we standardize that? How you invest in a real asset and how do we standardize that? How do you even get access to these assets, right? So if you think about one problem we had, like 2021, we launched the RWA focused lending market with Aave. And one big issue was we had to always go through KYC. And the big problem with KYC is you have to do it every single time with every single protocol, every single app that you're trying to use, which is a highly not interoperable system. And I think we all know that that's a problem that needs to be solved. But if you come back to the question of where are we today, we haven't solved that yet. So I think there's a long way to go there.
Yeah, lots to build. My name is Vikram. I'm one of the co-founders of Superform. Really, the Superform thesis is that what we've built in DeFi, thanks to all the things that make it great, it's open, permissionless. We've created the most fragmented industry that has possibly been known in technology. Yeah, and I think to go back to what we were talking about earlier, it's that the UX that users encounter when interacting with most of these assets on chain has a lot to be desired. And I think that's where interoperability comes in, is it provides the proper interface for people to finally be able to use crypto. And going back, we talked about Cosmos a little bit with Ethan, and I think imitation is the finest form of flattery here. And whenever Ethereum adopted the rollup roadmap, I think that's when we really started talking about this in these circles, as how important it is to have this infrastructure to be able to support all of an ecosystem, and not just Ethereum, but other ecosystems, Cosmos, Polkadot as well. And yeah, excited to talk about this and from an app perspective as well, this panel.
So, Vikram, maybe we'll come back to you. One of the ways I think about interoperability is like, is it like a public good or a private good, right? Or another way to think about it is, what is the driver for this, right? So Jeroen was just talking about when Centrifuge wanted to launch like an Aave lending market, right? What were kind of the hiccups they hit with the KYC? There's every app, every blockchain, every protocol, right, has its own kind of driver for why interoperability is important to them. But it seems to me that there needs to be consensus in the room, right? That this is like good for us writ large as an industry if we're going to see TradFi actually use these rails over time in a cohesive, kind of composable way. Help us understand from maybe Superform's view, and then we'll go backwards down the line. How do we think about this as like a public good or a private good? And what are kind of the drivers from your seat, from your view, on how you think about building interoperability in a way that benefits the industry writ large?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I
love those.
Yeah, I think that what the Ethereum ecosystem has done a really good job of doing is coalescing around standards. And that's really helped to be able to build not just applications, but for different layers of this to be able to talk to each other. So if you look at like the emerging, interop, chain abstraction infrastructure, you have settlement, you have solvers, you have a permissionless layer, and then you finally have applications. And for each one of these layers to talk to each other, we need to have public goods that are standards where we can properly be building these things as a group so that we're not just building the same thing over and over again. I think that's the extent to which public goods are important. I think it's probably a little bit pie in the sky to say these will all be subsidized by some benevolent organization. Last time we tried doing that was with like MEV, and Flashbots had a lot to be desired and a lot of those things. And I think base layer standards for public goods, and then we'll see where people take it from there, would be my take.
Maybe one thing to add there is I think if you think about ERCs as a standard and as a way of creating interoperability, a good example there is there's like 77,000 ERCs today, and there's maybe 10 that are being actively used or something on that order of magnitude. And I think the reason for that is in the end, standardization is a kind of social consensus problem where it's about getting many different parties to agree on something. And there is no technical rules. There's no enforcement that every token being deployed needs to follow the ERC20 standards. That is only followed because people get benefits from using that standards. I think that's coming back to the question, Colin, you were asking. The reason people, entities in the space will fund this work is because they get benefits from creating a more interoperable system. They will get more adoption, more users, better UX, because it's all happening in a cohesive and kind of composable system. So for me, that is right. The incentives are clearly there, and it's ultimately about social consensus and how to kind of agree on something together.
I think that, like, if we think how many situations we experienced in crypto in the last years, where interoperability has been a massive pain. I think, for example, when the Ethereum ecosystem started to go like multi-chain, even just the issue where we had different bridged versions of and everyone who has experienced in this room, I guess, like having 3 different versions of USDC on the same network, I think everyone, right? So even like those are, I think, early pains of a system where probably interoperability has not been thought from the bottom with a bottom-up approach. So like where things were start to be figured out as they went, essentially. And it was pretty clear from there that like there needs to be a way for users to be able to move between different systems without experiencing this kind of issues that like usually they bring like even for experienced users, they bring headaches, they bring financial losses, because like, for example, when you move in between different versions of USDC just because you bridged, am I allowed to say bridge? Because before we were saying don't say bridge. Like, no, just kidding.
Transfer insecurely.
Yeah, message, how was it? Messaging.
Just trustless messaging layers.
Yes, correct. So, yeah, I mean, when you move different versions when you end up with a different version of an asset compared to what is canonical on that particular network, just because you use a different messaging system, right? It means that something is missing, right? And it's definitely something that needs to be addressed in a way that is as open and public as possible.
Yeah, I mean, any open standard is going to be non-excludable and non-rivalrous by definition, and that makes it a public good. The question is, how do you, assuming there's no patents on it, how do you put it into production, and is it free to use? Is it permissionless? And what we see, there are interoperability standards that are completely free, that are permissionless, that anyone can utilize, and then there are some that are not, that have someone collecting a toll in the middle, and arguably the collection of the toll enables them to fund themselves further and to do marketing, BD, and enable growth, but it cements a middleman in there kind of indefinitely. And interoperability protocols are the one place where kind of fundamentally you don't want that, and you can't have that, and you really need the ability to communicate securely to be fundamentally a public good, and for it to be funded by all the kinds of different applications that can be built on top, and or by their use, right? And there are ways, and I think our space is one that's really trying to figure out what it looks like to effectively and sustainably fund public goods, and it's a very difficult problem. But there are a lot of goods we're creating, and interoperability is one of them. But it's arguably the most fundamental, right? And if imagine if using TCP/IP required you to pay a fee. It doesn't. You have to pay a fee to your ISP. But that's who's operating the protocol. But the protocol itself is open and free, right? And so we need to do something similar in the blockchain space. Make sure that the interoperability protocols we use are open and free. Operating those protocols might always cost something, right? Because you're using actual resources and you have to pay for real resources, right? But imagine if the ERC20 standard required you to pay a fee every time you used it to whoever wrote the initial standard. That it would never work, right? You'd have a lot more people trying to write standards, maybe, but that's maybe not what we want.
All right, I think I get some good points. There's a lot to dive into there. That's good. Maybe let's start to something Emilio said really jumped out at me, right? Like, even for experienced users, this creates a lot of pain. So even if you're thinking about like the crypto native, or most of us in the room, if we're experiencing that pain, God knows TradFi we can't even imagine what that might feel like for them, right? So maybe let's transition here for a second into thinking about interoperability. And Ethan, let's go back to you. When you think about interoperability, you guys have been doing this since 2016, right? Should we be thinking about interoperability different when we think about real-world assets, permissioned environments, the KYC, AML requirements, some of the compliance, the regs that might be needed, standards, right? What kind of standards, what kind of governing bodies does TradFi point a finger at if shit goes wrong, right? Like, how should we be thinking about interoperability in the context of DeFi, permissionless, on-chain? Like, that's one world, right? But then there's the interoperability of what we're all here to talk about today, which is when we think about tokenization, when we think about issuance, we think about these people in these institutions trying to bring them on chain. What does interoperability need to look like and feel like for these people? And is that any different from the way it needs to be feeling for and be usable in a crypto native sense for permissionless and kind of like DeFi related activities?
I think it's the same kind of problem ultimately, right? Like a lot of what we use on the internet are open standards, open protocols, right? Swift is, arguably maybe not that open, but it's just a standard that all the banks adopt and use, right? And so TradFi isn't, they're not averse to or they're not, incapable of developing standards and adopting them in a kind of similar vein as DeFi. What's important and what's maybe new to TradFi is enabling the kind of permissionless innovation, but figuring out how to do that in a way that can remain compliant, right? There's a bit of an obsession with like a compliance theater, right? Of like, oh, if only we just like tick all these boxes, then no crime is going to happen, and then the banks turn around and launder like billions of dollars for drug cartels or something, right? So it's all a little bit of a facade, and it'd be nice to be a little bit more real about that and about the cost and the friction that we create by running this theater, where we inhibit all this potential productivity and growth and verifiability and transparency just by creating this mess. And to that point of like, every time I have to do a new KYC with a new law firm in the same jurisdiction, I'm just like, how have we not solved? Whose fault is it that we haven't? So who can we blame? Who can we point to and
you got to point
blame?
the finger at
It's got to be someone. Someone is doing something wrong.
Not my fault.
Somewhere.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it feels like, maybe we can start there, right? Like if all the people in this room can just get together and be like, all right, by the RWA summit next year, we're going to have the KYC standard problem solved. So in each jurisdiction, you have to KYC once, and then everyone else, let's start with something simple like that, because the amount of time that will save for all of us will be sufficient to solve all the other problems we're going to have, right?
Here we go more, it's more of his world, I think. But no, jokes aside, is like...
What jokes?
Yeah, no, it was another
I'm dead
joke.
serious.
It's serious. No, there are many issues here when we think about like DeFi and then RWAs in terms of interoperability. We were talking about it shortly in the backstage. When we talk about DeFi, everything is nice and easy, right? Like we get an ERC20 token, you can move it anywhere. You can use it in any protocol that supports it, and so on and so forth. And you can transfer between wallets without having to ask permission to anyone, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, when we go more towards the real world, that scenario changes. In some cases, kind of dramatically. So you were talking about like protocols in TradFi. I think of regulation as protocol. So like regulations are protocols essentially, and whenever we plug into that world, we need to try to adapt our protocols to their protocols. That's the end game essentially. And in doing so, of course, we need to be willing to sacrifice maybe a bit of the, the ethos as well of the technology that we are building, because inevitably you are going to introduce some degrees of permissioned access and centralization to be able to comply to this protocol with these protocols. And the goal here is to try and smooth this out as much as we can in order to bring the benefits that we all experience with DeFi also to the real world, right? And so it is a problem that requires even more work, I think, because it's not only a technological problem, if you will. There is a problem also of social coordination here. And if we want to bring the next wave of users and the next wave of assets on-chain, this is something that we certainly need to aim to solve. And it's, for example, Centrifuge is doing an amazing job on that.
Yeah, I think the real world is messy, right? Like you bring up the KYC problem. It sounds like a very obvious problem to solve, and I think we've all been saying like, yeah, why am I doing this? It doesn't make any sense. But it's not as simple as knowing that a certain address is not from the US. And also, like, there's a lot of other complications to it. It's like the issuer might have regulatory requirements for knowing which the end investors are. There might be taxes. There might be a lot of other things involved. So point being, I think these are hard problems to solve. I do think this is also where we need to take a pragmatic approach and look at what is things that we can do in the short term to kind of improve UX for users in a way that we can start onboarding institutional users. I do think in the long term, solving some of these hard problems on the RWA side will require changes in regulation. And I think the best way that we can get changes in regulation is by actually having institutional users in DeFi, using the protocols, using the systems, and seeing the benefits of interoperability, seeing the benefits of composability, and therefore getting incentivized to help us change the system as it is today. I want to add to that, I think just on a little bit of a maybe positive note, right? Like the reality is interoperability is not a solved problem in traditional financial markets. There are some markets where there is a lot of interoperability, right? Like equities, for example, is very accessible. You can easily use equities as collateral for lending and all these kind of things. Private credit that was brought up this morning in the first session is very different and very on the opposite side. And there's a lot of unsolved problems in terms of how do we access these markets, how do we use these markets. And these markets have been around for decades, right? So it's not like people haven't spent time thinking about it. It's a hard problem to solve. And I think it's fair to realize that it's going to take some time. We're not going to solve this in a year.
Yeah, I think the ability for interoperability to actually bring down these walled gardens and compare it to traditional finance and really bring these assets on chain is probably one of the biggest selling points of why this happens better on chain generally. And having built like a interoperable DeFi app, I think that the ability for RWAs to be properly interoperable is much higher actually than a lot of traditional DeFi assets, because by nature interoperability is pretty much async and DeFi is very synchronous. We'll count on being able to get assets anywhere, anytime. But that time gap is something that's already built into how we issue RWAs. And until we have advanced interoperability features around shared sequencing and other things that people are working on but will take time, I think RWA assets actually make a ton more sense to be natively interoperable than than a lot of things we see in DeFi, actually.
All right. So Jeroen, coming back to you. You were saying something about like you were saying by this time next year we solve the KYC problem, right, for the RWA Summit, or by the next RWA Summit. Jeroen, though, you were talking about like the biggest problem, the UX, what this needs to feel like for institutional users. But you also said it's going to take a long time. So let's get a little more pointed here. In the next year, in the nearest term, what is the thing that interoperability needs to solve for now, in the next 12 months, to see better institutional user adoption and help them overcome some of the initial hurdles for interoperability? What's next step? Don't think 5 years, next 12 months. What do we need to solve? And then we'll go down the line.
I do actually think it is what Vic also just said, which is primarily that real-world assets are asynchronous, right? It's a very different paradigm than DeFi assets, where everything is synchronous and you can trade things atomically and so on. That is not the case for RWAs. That is a problem that we need to solve, something that we've been working on for years, right? If you think about investing in a real-world asset, you're not going to get that in a minute. You're going to get that in a day or a few days. If we can find a way where these RWAs are asynchronously traded, asynchronously used, but still fully interoperable, I think that is a huge step. I think that's the biggest part. I think KYC is the other big step. I do see a lot of like positive movements there, right? I think Coinbase with their Coinbase verifications program, where any user of Coinbase can basically get an on-chain attestation saying that they have a verified account, or they have passed KYC, they're from a certain country, is a really big building block, and they're kind of plugging that into base, and I think that's really exciting, and I think there will be a lot of other products like that. There's a lot of movement there, but still definitely work to be done.
Emilio?
I agree with him in the sense that being able, I don't know how many of you guys in the crowd have tried to use RWA products today. Like if you guys try to use any of those, it is not the best experience at the moment. And this is something that if we want to bring this asset class on chain, this is the first problem. In my opinion, like from my experience working with Aave, UX for users is the most important thing. Like,
how does it compare to like a TradFi brokerage UX? You think they do better? No offense to anyone in the room.
I don't necessarily think they do better, but there is that integration with the usage of permissionless protocols that is just not there. You know, so like whenever I get RWA assets on chain today, for example, if I get a tokenized fund on chain, I cannot use it almost anywhere. And the reason is that that particular asset cannot be integrated almost anywhere because, like as it was mentioned, it's asynchronous. So there are constraints in using it, for example, on Aave. So if you want to liquidate an RWA on Aave, you will not be able to liquidate it in the traditional way as it happens for permissionless assets, right? Where a liquidator comes in permissionlessly, takes the asset, sells it, repays the debt, everyone is happy, right? Unfortunately, you cannot.
Why not? I mean, don't you have a synchronous representation as a token?
We do, but the problem is that to access that particular asset, you need to be a user that can access that asset. Like, so you need to have
whitelist that might restrict you.
There are restrictions. There are whitelists. There is the KYC that everyone hates, and therefore you cannot allow anyone to take that asset and sell it to repay the debt, but it needs to be users that are authorized to do so.
Right.
So, yeah.
It depends on your definition of accessing RWAs, right? So if you're depositing into savings DAI today, you're getting access to RWAs essentially, right? So like Maker, like the DAI stablecoin is partially, I mean, significantly backed by real assets, by T-bills primarily. So yes, as a user, getting access, like basically getting access to the primary market, meaning that directly buying into some of these funds is still quite cumbersome. I think we're getting to a slightly better UX than off-chain exists today, and I think we can make a lot of big steps there. But it's not the only way to access these markets, right? So thinking of Go, like Go, I think and hope will at some point be backed by RWAs as well. So anyone using Go will effectively be getting exposure to RWAs as well. So I think that is probably the entry point and like the gateway point for a lot of users to start getting exposure to these assets.
But it's not. But it's probably not an entry point for institutions, though.
Probably not, but for an institution going through KYB is not that big of an issue, right? Like they've done that, they do it on a weekly basis for any of the investments they do today. For them, that is not the biggest hurdle. When we think about like KYC, everybody here is annoyed by it because they're used to like permissionless DeFi. But an institution that wants to deposit 10 million into some kind of fund, they're not going to care about the KYB that they have to do because that's not a hurdle for them. What they're going to care about is what are these assets? Like, is there something unique about these assets that doesn't exist off-chain? Or what can I do with these assets, right? So how can I integrate?
I think it's the second one. I think the first one's a moot point. I don't think anybody from TradFi is going, oh, that's an interesting asset class on chain. Not today. I think they're going, what can I do with this thing within the environment that you people have created?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the second point is primarily what people use for it today, right? So can I use this as collateral to borrow from Maker? Can I use this as to deposit it into Morpho markets or Aave markets? Or can I use it like those kind of things? I think that is indeed what an institution is going to primarily look for and the reason why they're going to tokenize assets.
Good. Just in some sense, USDC is like this archetypal real world asset. And the UX of, I mean, okay, there's only one issuer, right? But the UX, and probably most people are accessing it through the secondary markets rather than, redeeming or issuing through Circle directly. But otherwise, the UX seems like quite good. What does it take to get other real world assets to that level? And is it just that like, well, USD is such like a liquid asset in the first place that once you have it tokenized, it's going to be accepted anyway? How much of this is like a liquidity problem versus a, UX kind of standard interop problem? And how much are those the same thing? You were talking about private credit earlier, right? Like part of the problem there is like a liquidity issue, right? Like each credit is kind of unique compared to, equities.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, I in this particular case, like he mentioned DAI and the USDC as archetypes of, RWA, tokenized RWAs. I mean, the reality there is that the UX issues are still there. The difference is that there is an entity in the middle that abstracts that UX issues away. So Circle in the case of USDC, the Maker DAO in the case of Maker. So they take the responsibility of handling like that UX complexities or in terms of regulation, in terms of accessing the asset and so on and so forth, to then issue an asset that it's more easily usable within decentralized protocols, right? And permissionless protocols. So there is a UX kind of a bridge in terms of UX there that hides part of the complexities of using RWAs. This is interesting because it kind of allows users to access this particular asset class in a more transparent way, but it doesn't really solve the problem, in my opinion, for one reason, is that, for example, we mentioned institution and KYB before. So in our experience, what happens when an institution wants to access DeFi, there are way more issues than just the initial ability to access that market. There is the issues, for example, that many institutions, they cannot use permissionless protocols because permissionless protocols tend, for example, to put liquidity together. And this for them is an issue because they cannot afford to mix or supply assets in protocols where there are other assets of unknown origin. So one solution that we tried to address back in the days with Aave Arc is, okay, let's create a market where only authorized users, so there is no mixing, if you will, or supplying assets of unknown origin with assets of known origin. But that never really took any traction because then everyone is in the situation, okay, this is the only thing that I can do with this in this particular situation, but it's not really useful to me because I really need something that is happening outside of it, which is permissionless, but I cannot access it because there is the problem with, so like it was kind of an stand-up situation where everyone was not really able to use the product in the best way possible.
So maybe let's chase that down for a second. So is the idea then that we could use interoperability to create like a permissioned ecosystem that institutions could access to get the
I
utility that they need
tend-
to get from blockchains?
I tend to think it's going to be a hybrid.
Okay.
So where users that have certain requirements in terms of accessibility will be allowed to access permissionless systems that are only partially permissionless, and the permission part is going to be, for example, only for authorized users. I think, for example, of allowing me to borrow against tokenized bonds using permissionless liquidity. So the liquidity, users supplying the liquidity don't need to be, they can be access the system in a permissionless way. So liquidity provisioning happens in a permissionless way, and only the collateralization and borrowing part is for authorized users. So that's one option, for example. So I tend to think that the best trade-off will be in the middle, where system will be hybrid, partially permissionless and partially permissioned. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think the benefit of the fact that we have composable systems and open smart contracts and building all of this on public blockchains is that these different markets can interact, right? So you can have a fully permissionless market and a fully permissioned market, and you can have market makers using, like, bridging those two systems and making sure that liquidity on both sides is fulfilled, and kind of bringing it all together, right? You can have different parties creating like a shared ecosystem with different subsystems in it. And I think that is very likely where we're going to end up, where you have some users that prefer fully permissioned systems, and they're going to have their own kind of ecosystem. And you'll have fully permissioned systems, and you'll have movement in between those two things, or more than two, probably. I do think it's primarily a bootstrapping problem, right? Like, how do you get initial adoption of that? And I think that's where Treasury bills over the last year or two has been super interesting, where that's a clear initial use case, at least it was until like market rates changed 3 months ago, where there's a lot of demand, and it helped to like start create some of these markets. If the markets change again now, I think there will be a lot more adoption of that, and that will help to start creating these newer markets.
All right, so we got 2 minutes here. Ethan, we'll come back to you, Gu, and go down the line. So if we create this interoperable, permissioned ecosystem hybrid, I think I said all the words we just said, some version of that world, right? And we go to institutions and we say, come on, it's time to come on chain in mass, in droves. Ethan, maybe starting with you, what's the key use case that interoperability would unlock for institutions that would see the proliferation of RWA tokenization?
Key use case. I'm going to flip the question on its head, and I'm going to talk instead about real-world assets for institutions. I'm going to talk about institutional debts for real-world people. How about that?
You got
no,
15 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, I think the direction we really need to go is to instead of focusing blockchains on institutions, which I know what this is all about, and real world assets, real people have real debts that they struggle to pay, and we can actually do a lot to bring those on chain and enable them to clear them. And so if we flip the script from real world assets to real world debts and focus on the clearing function between individuals, then we can reconstitute what are previously like institutional clearing functions among real people and bring tremendous benefits to the real world. So that's my thought. That's Cycles.money. Check it out.
Like it. Yeah.
I like it as well. Good idea. Let's build it. No, I mean, I do agree that like DeFi and crypto already do a lot to favor this like permissionless access and collaboration and contribution between people, financial collaboration and contribution. In terms of, I mean, already a lot is happening in the RWA space. Like there is BlackRock. 1 year ago, talking to this institution about crypto and RWAs was like no go at all, And in 6 months, 1 year, things changed dramatically, and they are moving very, very fast. So I think that it's going to be, we are already towards a path. I can see a path where this dream of bringing more real-world adoption and kind of leaving this circular dependency that this crypto is living in at the moment is going to happen sooner than later. And probably many of the issues that we mentioned today is going to be they are going to be figured out along the way. We will not have all the answers right off the bat. We'll probably have some institutional version of different 3, 4, or 5 different instances of USDCs. the equivalent RWA in the RWA world of 5 different versions of USDCs on the same network probably will end up again in the same issue, but we will figure out in the end, I think.
Cool. Jeroen and Vikram.
Yeah, quickly coming back to, so I said before, I think primarily interoperability is a social consensus problem. I think what we have to realize is what is important is not what market share is each of our projects going to take. It's rather, are we going to be able to take DeFi from this 0.1% of like global financial markets that we have today to 100%? How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that together? And so we need to think about it as like solving these problems together to grow the pie, not take a larger share of the pie.
Yeah, I think there are all kinds of users of crypto right now, and we look at institutions, we look at normal, retail users, and looking at the interoperability infrastructure in particular, we have a lot to go in terms of making it more secure, making it cheaper, making it faster, and that's actually what I think is going to unlock this, this next level of market participants. And obviously, continue to standardize things, KYC, those things, so that whenever we bring these things on chain, they're actually composable with the rest of DeFi.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.